I don't have a photographic memory. I wish I did, or maybe I wish I didn't. But a long time ago, I decided I was in a really cool circumstance. I was on a picnic. It was with my first girlfriend. And I remember thinking like, gosh, she's so beautiful. I'm just going to take a picture. We were just sitting at this park that's up in the hills behind where I used to live. And I just went, and I decided, okay, like I remember the picture. Now, of course, in my mind now, it's blurry. Like I don't remember specific details, but I remember more or less, I think I remember that the angle was that. And then like a year and a half ago, I was in Manhattan. I was in an Uber and I just was like, maybe I could just do that for a trivial street scene. So I just like, look, there was one of those scaffolds for construction. And I just decided, just do that. And there was a guy walking by and I'm like, I wonder if I'll remember it. And I still remember it. Now, the question I have is, do I actually remember the content of what I saw besides just their crude, the scaffold, the guy in one case, my girlfriend, we were sitting on this nice big lawn above, there's just this lake there. It's a beautiful spot in Palo Alto, it's still there. Or is what's stamped in my decision to do that and the sort of conscious collection of it, is it these weren't like big emotionally salient events. The difference between these visual memories and other visual memories is that the emotional load wasn't that high, but I made the decision to do it. It was like, it was coming from me. It wasn't, so I'm not just trying to remember like we also went to, it was her senior, my junior prom. Like I remember a few things from that prom, but I can't remember, I don't have a visual picture of the prom. But the prom was also a lot more emotionally, laden than anything I just described. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's a fascinating question because I think selection is the important thing here, that you're making a conscious decision like this is a special moment. Can I just take a picture of it? And the work on visual memory is interesting. We are very visual people, but the research on photographic memory does show that even people who have very strong visual memory will make memory errors. So it's not that, it's exactly photographic, but their visual memory is exceptional. I think what's interesting here, and this is something I think is important, is the selection process that you're choosing. This is a special moment. I'm going to timestamp it and remember it. You're not, doing anything special other than realizing a lot is going on. Now, there's probably some emotional valence there versus taking this random picture in New York City. And it would be interesting to kind of test your memory later, because we know sometimes we think we remember something well, and in fact, we misremember things or details. And hopefully, you got the right girlfriend, of course, but maybe the hill looks a little bit different. Or sometimes people are like, of course it was spring because we went to the prom, but it's like, no, actually, now that, it was a different season entirely. That was fall and confusing with the other picnic I took. But I think that's important, especially as, we get older, that there are some memories. These days we have our phones for everything. So you probably couldn't then, but you could have pulled out your phone and actually taken a picture. And you see a lot of people offloading information now. I'm not going to remember this, I'll take a picture. There is some research showing that act of deciding to take the picture actually improves your own memory.
For the event.
For the event.
Interesting.
Now, it can also make your memory worse because you're realizing, I'm taking this photo so I don't need to remember it later. And so you could see it going both ways. But that selection process is important. So sometimes you're choosing, this is mundane, I'm going to offload it and take a picture. Or this is a special moment, I want to take this picture. And I see it, when I take pictures of my family, this is a special moment, I want to take this photo. But there are times where I'm like, I don't have my camera, I don't want to interfere. This is going to be like an internal memory that I can take. And hopefully it lasts forever.
I tell myself that my mindset at the time was, this is a special moment, I never want to forget this.
Yeah.
I hope I never forget it.
Well, memory is reconstructive. And I think, the more you retrieve it and go back there, the more you'll have this feeling of remembering it. And our brain does a lot of interesting things in terms of, reconstructing the past also has a similar brain signature as imagining the future, which, in some ways makes sense. We shouldn't have separate parts of the brain for thinking about the past and thinking about the future. But that can kind of then predict why you might misremember something, why your imagination has to be based surely on the experiences you've had already, right? Or, if I say, what would it be like to go to Mars? Well, you've never been to Mars, but you've seen movies in the past about it. So our, if I said, imagine a space alien, you and I, being similar age, are probably going to think of the ET version of one. Whereas someone who's younger than us might have a very different kind of representation of that. So it's interesting to think of memory as kind of a reconstruction of the past, but also imagining the future involves, our past experiences.
Never thought about it that way. It's the perfect time, I think, to raise the quote that a former guest on this podcast put on social media the other day. They weren't his words, but this Morgan Housel, who did a really wonderful episode on the psychology of money. And I really love his first book, but also his second book, The Art of Spending Money. He said it's a Russian quote: "The past is more unpredictable than the future."
Yeah.
Goodness, that raises questions about eyewitness testimony, spousal arguments. I occasionally will get an email. My wife and I have a debate, or my husband and I are debating, and I have a rule: I don't get into spousal debates or arguments of any kind. So, do we remember things the way they happened, or do we confabulate? Do we muck it all up?
I don't think we muck it all up, and I don't think we do it intentionally either. But as a result of all the information we have in our memory, we're constantly interpreting, the future and our current state. And you spoke a little bit about eyewitness memory. I think that's a really good example of that, where something horrible might have happened. And like your experience, where you think you're taking a picture and you're going to remember everything. And it feels like you will. I can remember the shirt. I can remember the smell. I can remember the weather. And sometimes that can be accurate, but a lot of research shows that sometimes we misremember these things. And some of these classic cases, unfortunately, now that there's DNA evidence, you can determine that maybe they got the wrong person. And when that happens, you want to look back and say, how could that happen? And some of it comes down to faulty eyewitness identification. And these are not cases where people are lying or intentionally changing things, but they'll identify someone. They'll say, that's the person. And as a result of identifying that person in a lineup, that person then replaces what they actually saw. So our memory can be contaminated, just like any form of evidence could be contaminated. And then when you replay it again, you're replaying the person you identified, not the person you actually saw.
Wow. So it's almost like as we become more familiar with this person that we identified, quote unquote, our knowledge about them, facial features, et cetera, is elaborated in our brain, and we superimpose that on the actual experience.
Yeah. And this is, one of the most famous cases, Ronald Cotton case, where really horrible event happened. And the woman made a point of trying to remember her attacker. So it wasn't just she got a quick glance, but she had a long interaction with him, and that's, a traumatic event. And she said, if I survive this, I want to remember his face so I can identify him later. So this is like the perfect situation where your memory should be sharp. And it was cross-race identification, which we know is not as reliable as identifying someone of your own race. And when she saw a lineup, she took her time and said, this feels like it's a multiple choice test, and I studied hard for it. She took her time and she identified the person, and she thought in her mind, this is the person who was inches from my throat. And she identified him, and he had an alibi that didn't stand up, and he was, then found guilty. And it was only, decades later that DNA evidence exonerated him, and she felt horrible. She felt like, and there's a lot of reasons why this could happen, whether leading questions or how the identification process was conducted. But she was trying to do what she felt was her job and take someone who she thought was guilty off the street. And later they got to meet, in fact, and she, could apologize to him. She felt terrible. And so this is one case study, and, I wouldn't draw any conclusions, but it had a lot of the principles that we've talked about, where you feel like you're taking a photo. It's a cross-race identification where your confidence might be high for a good reason, but accuracy might not be. And then this kind of changing of the face, whereas once you identify the face, that's what you start to remember. And so I think there's a lot of interesting memory principles at play here.
How does the legal system deal with this kind of thing? I mean, nowadays there's so many more cameras and phones which can track location. Yeah. I like to think those things have improved the courtroom scenarios, that it's harder for people to make genuine mistakes?
Yeah, I think it's, memory should be treated as one source of evidence, just like DNA, just like any sort of evidence. But also we need to be aware that it can be contaminated, just like any other source of evidence as well. So we can't just say, oh, well, DNA evidence is perfect. Well, it can also be contaminated in predictable ways. And I think, coming back to this idea of metacognition, most people feel like they have a pretty good understanding of how memory works, but it's not always accurate. And sometimes high confidence doesn't necessarily mean high accuracy. And I think part of the reason we're fooled is usually, the more you see something, the better you'll remember it, just like the Apple logo. But that's not always the case. And there's predictable reasons why the more you see something, the more you might stop attending to the features, or you don't need to use it. And so that is a more kind of predictable memory principle. But we don't have this, always accurate metacognitive insight. And I think that's interesting. I think that's both concerning, in the eyewitness memory case, but it's also important for learning. How can we be kind of effective and maximize our learning?
I have a question about what I want to call medium-term memory. I don't even know if that's a real term. Short-term memory, working memory, listeners of this podcast may or may not be familiar, but working memory is like keeping a phone number online in your head or a string of numbers until you need it. And then kind of, you may or may not remember it long-term. Long-term memory, obviously, long-term memory. But there's this thing that I do. Today's a bit of a confessional. So when I check into hotels, I always look at the map of how to get out in a fire, because once, staying at a hotel in San Francisco for a donor event, the alarm went off in the middle of the night. Everyone, of course, stuck their head out to look to see if anyone was leaving, and everyone was like, we're not leaving. And then they called everyone's room. It was an actual fire, which taught me, like, when the alarm goes, go.
Right.
And it was pretty confusing.
Yeah.
Wide hallways, wasn't clear. Exit sign was not to like the actual stairwell. It was, it was not a good situation, but of course got out fine. But from now on, before I go to sleep, I go and I look at where you are here. Yeah. I look for the exit. I occasionally walk the hall. I don't want to be in this situation again, especially in a high rise. I just do not want to be in a situation where I can't get out of a building that's on fire. I figure it takes like 5 minutes. People laugh at me. I do this, but I make a mental map. Okay, so let's assume it's smoky. I do this thing. Okay, which is the closer door? I would go right, then left, right, then left, right. Okay, so I drill it in my head. Good, then I go to sleep. I never remember the maps, but it's not working memory. It's not short-term memory. I couldn't tell you for the life of me what the last hotel map looked like in my head. It had a "you are here" red dot, it had doors, it had exits. So it had these component parts. But what term memory is that? And thank goodness I don't remember, because it's going to change every time I'm in a different hotel.
Yeah.
So what are the mechanisms that allow for selective forgetting that's healthy? And also, is medium-term memory an actual thing?
Well, I think when you're saying medium-term, that's your everyday basic memory function, where you're like, I need to remember things, but I don't think I need to remember them that long, but I really need to remember them today or tonight. And it makes me sleep better at night. And I've had a similar experience. I was staying in a hotel with my family, and the fire alarm went off. And we're like, what do we do? Well, we know we don't take the elevator. That's what you're always told. And I don't think I looked at the map, but I looked down the hall, and I swear when I looked down the hall, I saw smoke. And so I'm like, let's not go that way. So we went down the other way. We rushed down the stairs. We got outside, and the kids were pretty, traumatic. And actually, one of our children was like 8 stories ahead of us going down the stairs. But what's interesting is I thought I saw smoke, and that's, maybe I didn't have my glasses on, but that's my mind playing tricks on me. So maybe that was my concern. But I think that, this everyday memory is really relevant. And when you're studying that map, you're making notes of like, okay, it's close by, it's down the hall, I have to go down here. And that can be very informative and useful for survival. And there's some research saying that that's basically what our brain is tuned towards, is surviving. Where am I going to eat? How am I going to sleep? How am I going to... So when you say everyday memory, I think that's probably the most important thing. And part of that memory formation is also then forgetting it and updating it. It's as simple as you need to know your hotel room number when you're staying there. But if I ask you your hotel room number a week later, it's gone. But that's good in a way, because you're going to have other numbers to remember and other hotel room numbers to remember. So there's benefits of forgetting. And you want to, so I think that's an interesting insight. You're doing some processing to remember something, but then you need to update it and forget it. And, it's the same thing. I think the best thing you can do in that case is, studying the map is one thing, but some people aren't great with maps and where am I in the hotel, is doing that active learning of actually walking the halls of like, well, I go down here and there's the elevator, so I can't go there. Oh, there are the stairs. I'll remember that. And then you can kind of encode it. So that sort of active learning is like us with the fire extinguisher. We made people get up and find it instead of telling people where it was. And I'm always, when you're on a flight, they'll always say there's 6 emergency exits on this plane. And then I think they do the wrong thing. They tell you where they are. I think the best thing would be to say, there's 6 emergency exits on this plane.
I'm not going to tell you where they are.
Well, I'm not going to say not where they are, but go find them. And I notice, maybe it's just myself being anxious, as soon as they say that, I'm looking behind me, I'm making sure I know where they all are. Whereas most people are like, oh, they pointed here, here, and here. And I'll even say, sometimes the nearest one is behind you. And I'm like, well, I want to see where it is behind me. And so I think that sort of active learning, whether you call it everyday memory, is really important. And I think when we talk about memory, people are like, I can't remember names. I'm like, that's kind of a common thing. But if you need to sometimes remember, like, what medication are you taking, or how did you react the last time you saw this person? And those sorts, I think it's really important to be in tune with what you're calling this kind of everyday average memory.
I'd like to take a quick break and acknowledge our sponsor, AG1. AG1 is a vitamin mineral probiotic drink that also includes prebiotics and adaptogens. I discovered AG1 way back in 2012, long before I ever had a podcast, and I've been taking it every day since. The reason I started taking AG1 and the reason I still take it every day is because AG1 is, to my knowledge, the highest quality and most comprehensive of the foundational nutritional supplements on the market. AG1 is designed to support things like gut health, immune health, and overall energy. And it does so by helping to fill any gaps that you might have in your daily nutrition. I get asked pretty much all the time, if I could only take one supplement, what should that supplement be? And my answer is always AG1. It has just been so helpful for supporting all aspects of physical health, mental health, and performance. If you would like to try AG1, you can go to drinkag1.com/Huberman to get a special offer. For a limited time, AG1 is giving away a free bottle of their new omega-3 coenzyme Q10 product. Omega-3 and coenzyme Q10 are known to support cardiovascular health, cellular health and energy generally, brain health, and much more. I personally take them both every day. Again, go to drinkag1.com/Huberman to get a free bottle of the new omega-3 coenzyme Q10 with your first AG1 subscription. Thank you for that. And I'm going to use that as weaponry when I get teased for walking the fire exits. But it was in part because the first time people were asking, hey, do you know if we should leave? Do you know which way to go? And I realized, okay, next time it might as well be me. I'll be the guy that knows which way to go, certainly for myself. And then I can tell other people which way to go. Nobody else here knows where to go. And most likely they're not going to know the next time. I do the thing on the plane too. I think, okay, I actually read the thing of how to take it out, because I figure, well, I've experienced how under conditions of very high arousal, you just default to what almost feel like whatever was trained, whatever reflexes you have. I mean, I had a scuba diving accident years ago, and I don't like to say, came close to the end, but it was an air failure and it was a whole mess. And you just default to, we had to do the whole share air thing. It was a precarious situation to begin with. And you just default to these routines. Actually, recently I watched what I think is a spectacular documentary about Dean Potter, he was a free solo climber, a predecessor to Alex Honnold. He was kind of the guy to beat, and Honnold passed him up pretty early. And he got into wingsuiting and base jumping and the whole thing. And there was this, there's a scene where, so be warned if you watch this amazing 4-part series, there's a scene where people who are doing base jumping in Yosemite are advocating for it being legal in Yosemite. It's illegal. And so there were a bunch of spectators there, and they were doing this big demonstration jump, and a woman who was a very, very seasoned base jumper, she didn't want to use her own gear because they were confiscating people's gear at the bottom. So she borrowed someone else's gear, and she jumps, and she's used to pulling from a leg pull, I guess it is. And you just see her the whole way down, and she's got a parachute on. Yeah. And just, not to give it away, but I guess, gave it away that she dies. But the whole way down, you can see her just doing this routine movement. Yeah. And she put on a different pack. She knew that it was a different pull location. So under conditions of very high arousal, even highly trained people, for that condition, they just default to whatever it is that they're used to doing. And if you don't know what to do, you default to not knowing what to do. If you know what to do, you default to what you think you need to do in one situation. And I've had that experience scuba diving. It's very clear from this documentary. And I think we're all a little naive in thinking that, oh no, like when the alarm goes and everything is crazy, like I'm going to sort through this in a regimented way, like, or I'll be so keyed up, I'll have to figure it out. This is not quite the case. The brain seems to not work that way.
Yeah, I think we discover that, in these extreme situations, but also even kind of in some simple situations, there's a really concerning thing that happens, that people will leave children, infants, in the back of their car unattended, and, these infants will die
on hot days.
Yeah. And when you look at these investigations, the reason this happens is, these are very responsible, very intelligent parents who will, put their child in the car and then get in the car, and then you just get in this mode of, I'm going to work, I'm going to do my job, and you're in this routine. The baby falls asleep, you drive to work, you go upstairs, you do it, and then you get this phone call of like, where's your infant, or why haven't they been dropped off? And you're thinking, what are you talking about?
Whoa.
Exactly.
I'm sure many people listening to this are like, there's no way. There's no way.
Well, I think there's no way that could happen to me. This must be some person who's super distracted or has this. Sadly, it happens too often to people, all sorts of people. And I think that's part of the issue is like you're saying, she's going to grab the strap where it normally is. You drive to work 100 times this way, but it's this one day where it was your turn to take the infant to daycare. And you just get into this mode, this habit, this routine. And now we have to have, our car talking to us. Some cars will even say, have you checked the back seat for an infant? And it's like, gosh, have we come to that level where we need to be reminded of these things? So I think that's where, you're right, it becomes lethal. That, sometimes it's talked about in terms of prospective memory, of remembering to do something in the future. We think of memories usually as remembering to do something from the past, right? But a lot of it is, what do you have to do today? Are you meeting this person? We offload this to our phones and get reminders. But we're prone to forgetting, and especially you're talking about high arousal, this person's falling, but it's even as simple as when you're in the car, and you're probably aware when you're in the car, you start mind wandering, you're thinking of a million other things, and all of a sudden you've arrived somewhere or you missed your turn. So our brain kind of takes over in ways that we might not be sure about.
Yeah, one of the things that spooks me about scuba diving, and I love scuba diving, is, I got my PADI certification because it's a bit more involved. But it worries me that you actually don't have to update. And if you do, not very often. Like it's been 5 years since I went scuba diving last time, but I've got my card, I have my gear. Yeah. And if somebody wants to go scuba diving tomorrow, I can do it legally. Yeah. But there's a lot involved. Yeah. Like you need to brush up. And so, here in the United States, we have all this, people can sue each other. There are all these legal protections, but there's still a lot of ways in which we can do damage to ourselves or others just by virtue of the fact that we don't have to brush up on driving skills. Yeah. It's kind of a shock to me that we don't have more problems related to forgetting.
It's true. I think the more you think about it, it's amazing how much we do remember, especially under some circumstances. But I agree that a lot of this, scuba diving too, because you're underwater with buoyancy, you have to figure things out. And I got certified too when I was 20. I wouldn't trust myself to do it again. I'd want to probably take the entire course again. And but when you're 30, maybe you feel confident. And, especially drivers, like new drivers, you give very little training to younger drivers. And then you're on your own. I've seen it with my children learning to drive. I also realize I'm not as good a driver as I thought I was. I'm certainly passing on some habits that I probably should be more aware of, and they're more rule-based. They're aware of how to do things. But I have this feeling, like this wisdom, well, you don't need to do that, or, that's the rule, but I do it this way. So I think you're right. I think revisiting these things more often and being more cognizant probably would make us safer.